So moving on to the Madeleine McCann case, the first thing upon watching the most recent Netflix series, and I'm sure lots of people who are listening will have seen it as well, the first thing that struck me was how, I don't want to say bungled, but how oddly the case was dealt with upon immediate investigation in terms of the crime scene, in terms of everything else. That was probably one of the most shocking things I got out of it.
Well, when you mentioned the crime scene, and I guess you're thinking about the accounts, which I've obviously also, although we were interviewed for the series, we weren't part of it. In the Netflix series, we are in each episode, so we have watched it closely. And we found that virtually everything, and I mean 99.9%, was accurate so far as we know. And we, I think, ourselves in the shows discuss what happened in the crime scene. Woman goes into apartment, apparently, finds child missing, goes out, makes a terrible cry. All their considerably large party, 9 or 10 people, the other doctors and their friends, come rushing to the apartment. They're all there, all trampling around the apartment. And then the police are called. When the police eventually arrive, they come in, they trample around the apartment. At some point, dogs come into the search dogs come into the apartment. And that is completely contrary to what the police like, the way the police like a crime scene to be handled, in what they call the golden hour, the first hour. That is why when one sees, for instance, a shooting in the street, you see on the news nightly scenes in which the police have put up tapes and stop people trampling over the golden evidence, the first evidence. The evidence was there. And that wasn't done in this case. But you talk about the possible bungling and so on. Well, there was bungling at some stage in the investigation. But there's also a thing called human nature. When the police were called to the apartment, they thought there was a little girl who was missing. Had she wandered off? What had happened? Where was she? Maybe she's going to turn up in the wardrobe, under the bed. Maybe she's there really. Maybe she's just hiding from mummy and daddy. And of course, none of that proved to be the case. But during that time, people were not thinking of a crime, a possible crime. They weren't thinking of something sinister that wouldn't be solved for more than a decade. They were just trying to find that little girl who might be here. So there was a reason and a sort of a justification for why the golden hour was ignored.
Mm. I suppose it's a short-term pain for a long-term gain that you need to make a judgment on upon the beginning of the case, right? They want to think, oh, well, if she is in here somewhere or if it's not a crime, we need to work more expeditiously rather than delicately. But obviously the benefit of hindsight is fantastic. And looking back, you say, well, why didn't they just close the case off?
I think what you say is true, but I also think it was a resource and division of labor issue as well. But the first Portuguese police officers to arrive on the scene were the sort of local beat cops who would not necessarily have been all that clued into the idea of crime scene preservation, etc. Whereas immediately, an hour later, when the more senior detectives arrived, they were themselves horrified by this, tarnishing of the evidence by having all these people trample it. They were none too pleased with their colleagues that this had happened, and I think that was then compounded. That the Portuguese police's initial mistakes in terms of the crime scene were then compounded by two other things. One, they failed to clear the parents of involvement. Usually in cases like this, it is always a family member who you look at first. And in the words of the policeman who was responsible for reviewing this case and deciding, it wasn't handled very well, he thought that they had failed to clear the ground in front of them. And that's an important mistake that should have been addressed very early on. Instead, it festered. And the second thing was the involvement of the British police. You had a crime or an abduction or a missing child taking place in Portugal, but she's a British child. So therefore, the parents who don't speak the language are immediately reaching out for all the support they can get. And that's coming back at them in terms of multiple police agencies, all wanting to help, all wanting to get their patch in, all wanting to be the hero. And that also didn't play well. It felt to the Portuguese like the Brits were trampling all over them and being a colonial power and being arrogant. And the Portuguese themselves became very suspicious. What are all these, British police officers doing? And we're actually having their British police colleagues followed. So the bad relationship, again, didn't help in any attempt to find Madeleine.
Also, the British thought that the Portuguese were living in the Stone Age, in the sense that they weren't computerized in the way that people from when Scotland Yard eventually became involved, or just the police that were sent out on liaison at first from England. They saw all the cards in boxes and a sort of temporary headquarters with a lot of paperwork and so on, and guys typing with two fingers on old typewriters. That's not how it happens at police headquarters in England anymore. And so there grew a feeling that the Portuguese felt as though they were being, at a certain level, thought they were being treated as though they were from the third world.